I'm going to be reading about Extroverted Feeling from Marie-Louise von Franz's lectures on typology, on Jung's typology, from her lecture transcription series on the inferior function. The extroverted feeling type, inferior introverted thinking. The extroverted feeling type is characterized by the fact that his main adaptation is carried by an adequate evaluation of outer objects and an appropriate relation to them. This type will therefore make friends very easily, will have very few illusions about people, but will be capable of evaluating their positive and negative sides appropriately. These are well-adjusted, very reasonable people who roll along amiably through society, can get what they want quite easily, and can somehow arrange it that everybody is willing to give them what they want. They lubricate their surroundings so marvelously that life goes along very easily. You find them frequently among women, and they generally have a very happy family life with a lot of friends. Only if they are in some way neurotically dissociated do they become a bit theatrical and a little mechanical and calculating. If one goes to a luncheon party with an extroverted feeling type, she or he is capable of saying little things like, "What a nice day it is today. I'm so glad to see you again. I haven't seen you for a long time." And they really mean it. With that, the car is lubricated, and the party goes. One feels happy and warmed up. They spread a kind of atmosphere of acceptance, and it is agreeable. We appreciate each other, so we are going to have a good day together. They make those in their surroundings feel wonderful. And in the midst of that, they swim along happily and create a pleasant social atmosphere. Only if they overdo it, or if their extroverted feeling is already worn out and they therefore should start to think, do you notice that this becomes a bit of a habit, that it becomes a phrase which they say mechanically. For instance, I once noticed an extroverted feeling type on a dreadful day when there was a horrible fog outside saying mechanically, "Isn't it a wonderful day?" I thought, oh dear, your main function is rattling. Because people of the extroverted feeling type have such a tremendous capacity for objectively feeling the other person's situation, they are usually the ones who most genuinely sacrifice themselves for others. If one is alone at home with the flu, it is certainly an extroverted feeling type who will turn up first and ask who is doing the shopping and how he can help. Other types are not so quick and practical about feeling their way into a situation. To the others, even though their affection might run as deeply, it would not occur that they could do this or that to help, either because they are introverts or because another function is dominant in their system. So you find the extroverted feeling type always jumping into the breach. For wherever something does not function properly, he realizes it at once. He sees the importance or the value of what should be done, and he just does it. Naturally, this can lead to resistance against the outer situation. In general, this type has very good taste in the choice of partners and friends, but he is a little conventional about it. He wouldn't risk choosing someone too much out of the ordinary. He wants to remain in a socially acceptable framework. The extroverted feeling type dislikes thinking because that is his inferior function, and what he dislikes most of all is introverted thinking, thinking about philosophical principles or abstractions or basic questions of life. Such deeper questions are carefully avoided, and there is the reaction that thinking about such problems is melancholy. The unfortunate thing is that he does think of such things, but he is not aware of it, and because his thinking is neglected, it tends to become negative and coarse. It consists of coarse, primitive thinking judgments, without the slightest differentiation, and very often with a negative tinge. I have also seen in the extroverted feeling type very negative thoughts about the neighboring people, very critical, I would say overcritical thinking judgments, which he never allows really to come out. Jung says that the extroverted feeling type can sometimes be the coldest person on earth. It may happen that if you get lured into this well-lubricated car of his extroverted feeling and feel, we like each other and we get along well together, suddenly one day he will say something to you which will feel like getting smacked on the head with a block of ice. One cannot guess what cynical, negative thoughts he might have. He's not aware of them, but they pop out when he begins to have the flu or when he is rushed. In such moments when the inferior function wells up and the control of the superior function fails. An extroverted feeling type once dreamt that she should establish a bird observation station. I love this one. She saw in the dream a cement building, a tower built high up in the air, and on the top was a kind of laboratory where one observed birds. We have such a Vogelbeobachtungstation station, a bird observatory at Simpak, where rings are put on birds to know how long they live and where they go and so on. She was to do that. So we thought she should try to be aware of autonomous thoughts, which would, as it were, alight on her head and go again. That is how thoughts operate in a feeling type. He has bird thoughts. They alight on his head and fly off again. Before he can say, "What am I thinking?" the thought is gone again. This woman agreed, and I asked her how it could be done technically. She said she would take a little notebook and a pencil and carry them around with her, and then when she had a sudden thought, she would just jot it down. We would see afterward how they were connected. Next time she brought one piece of paper, and on it was, "If my son-in-law died, my daughter would come back home." She got such a shock from that thought that she never put a ring on a second bird. That one bird was quite enough for a long time. She then confessed something even more interesting. She said that in a way, she knew she sometimes had such thoughts, but always figured that if she didn't write them down, they would not be effective. If she did, they would act like black magic and affect her surroundings. So she avoided looking at them. Now that is exactly wrong. It is just the other way around. If the feeling type is aware of his negative thoughts, they don't act like black magic. They are depotentiated of any destructive effect. It is just when they are left alone and fly around his head without being caught that they actually have a destructive influence on his surroundings. If one analyzes an extroverted feeling type and is somewhat sensitive to the atmosphere, one very often gets a bit frozen or cooled down in spite of his amiability. One can sense these negative thoughts swarming around in his head. Such thoughts hit one in a disagreeable way. One sometimes sees a kind of cold flash in the eyes and knows that there is a very negative thought about, but the next moment it is gone. It gives one the creeps. Such thoughts are generally based on a very cynical outlook on life, the dark side of life, which is illness and death and other such things. A kind of second philosophy of life, cynical and negativistic, creeps around in the background. In the extroverted feeling type, these thoughts are introverted, and therefore they are very often turned against the subject as himself. At bottom, he allows himself to think that he is a nobody, that his life is worthless, and that everybody else might develop and get on the path of individuation, but he is hopeless. These thoughts dwell in the back of his mind. From time to time, when he is depressed or not well off, or especially when he introverts, that is, when he is alone for half a minute, this negative thing whispers at the back of his head, "You are nothing. Everything about you is wrong." These thoughts are coarse and primitive and very undifferentiated. They are generalized judgments and are like a cold drought which blows through the room and makes you shiver. The effect is that the extroverted feeling type naturally hates to be alone when such negative thoughts could come up. So as soon as he has realized one or two of them, he quickly switches on the radio or rushes out to meet other people. He never has time to think, but he carefully arranges his life in that way. If this woman who had the one little thought, "My only daughter would come back home," had dug deeper, she would have had to say to herself, "Okay, let's face that thought. What am I after? If I have such a thought, what is the premise? And what is the conclusion to be drawn?" She could then have developed the following thought. The premise is something like a devouring mother's attitude, and the conclusion is that she wants the son-in-law removed. Why? For what purpose? She could, for example, have said, "Assuming that my daughter does come home, what then?" And then she would have seen how unpleasant it would actually be to have a sour old maid of a daughter at home. In continuing the thought, she would have probably dropped into a deeper layer and said, "And what then? If my children have now left home, what is the real purpose of my life?" She would have had to philosophize about the future purpose of her life, Has life still a meaning once one has brought up the children and started them into life? And if so, what is it? What is the meaning of life altogether? She would have been confronted with the deep but generally human philosophical questions which she had never faced before, and that would have brought her into deep water. She naturally could not have solved the problem, but she might have had a dream to help the whole process along. With her inferior thinking function, she would have started on a quest for the meaning of life. Because she was an extroverted feeling type, the quest would have been a completely introverted inner thing, like developing an introverted philosophical view of life. That would have needed being alone a long time in her room, and slowly getting aware of the dark underground of her thoughts. The easy escape, which I've seen in several cases of extroverted feeling types, is that they get out of the difficulty by simply selling their souls to some already established system. One case I remember got converted to Catholicism and simply took over scholastic philosophy. From then on, she quoted only scholastic authors. That was, in a way, taking up the thinking function, but taking it up in an already established form. The same thing can be done with Jungian psychology. It will become a matter of simply repeating the concepts by heart in a mechanical way, but never working out one's own standpoint. It is a kind of pupil-like, uncreative attitude which just takes over the entire system unchecked and never asks, what do I think about it? Does this really convince me? Does it coincide with the facts I have checked? If such people then meet others who themselves know how to think, they get fanatical because they feel helpless. They fight for the system they have chosen with a certain apostle-like fanaticism because they feel uncertain about the basis of the thinking system, how the system developed, its basic concepts, etc. They are uncertain about it and have the feeling that it could be thrown over by a good thinker, so they adopt an aggressive attitude. Another danger is that if an extroverted feeling type once starts to think, he gets completely caught up in it. Either he cannot cut off his relationships sufficiently to be alone and think, or if he succeeds, which is already great progress, in cutting off those outer ties, he gets terribly caught by them and loses sight of life. He disappears into books or into a library where he gets covered with dust and is no longer able to switch to any other activity. He gets swallowed by his task. Both developments are very well represented in Goethe's Faust, where first there's the scientist absolutely cut off from life in the dusty study, and then when Faust frees himself and goes out into life, the inferior thinking of the feeling type is represented by Wagner, the pupil-like servant who just repeats the banal phrases he has picked up in books. A famous example of the inferior thinking of an extroverted feeling type is Goethe's Conversations with Eckermann. It is an amazing collection of platitudes. There you see the Wagner side of Goethe, very visibly exposed to the world. He has also published a collection of maxims, which you might meet on the back leaf of every calendar. They are very true, you can rarely object to them in any way, but they are so banal that any sheep could have thought of them. That is Wagner at work in the great poet. Again, this is von Franz's lectures on typology, the inferior function. All right, thanks for watching.